Betty Greene, Chapter 5, Higher Than She'd Ever Been Before. Betty's first target towing flight turned out to be more eventful than she could have imagined. After taking off in a Lockheed B-34 bomber, a large canvas target flapping on the end of a cable behind the plane, Betty climbed to 2,000 feet. As she did so, a male officer sent to check her out on her first flight in the aircraft dozed in the co-pilot's seat beside her. Betty wasn't sure whether his actions showed complete confidence in her flying ability or complete contempt for her as a woman pilot. She suspected the latter, as most of the men at Camp Davis seemed to resent the women pilots of the Wasp. At 2,000 feet, Betty leveled off the airplane. As she proceeded to make a pass over the gunnery range where the anti-aircraft gunners were practicing, shells began to burst around the Lockheed bomber. Betty was frightened. This was her first flight towing a target, and she had no idea whether or not this was normal. As she was debating whether to wake the officer sleeping next to her and ask him whether or not it was normal, a shell exploded so close to the plane that in a split second, the officer went from sleeping to sitting bolt upright. "What was that?" he yelled. "Shells are exploding all around us. Is that normal?" Betty asked. Normal, the officer spluttered. "Some fool down there is aiming right at us and not the target. What are they trying to do, shoot us down?" With that, he began barking orders over the radio to the ground, and soon the shelling stopped. Betty made several more runs over the anti-aircraft gunnery range, but they were less eventful, with the gunners this time aiming and shooting at the canvas target trailing behind the Lockheed bomber. The weeks rolled by, and although Betty had no more close calls, she was always careful when she flew. Her superiors must have taken note, because early one morning in January 1944, a messenger arrived at Betty's barracks. "I have orders for Elizabeth Greene," the messenger said, handing Betty an official-looking envelope. Betty thanked the messenger and sat down to read the orders. She was being reassigned to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, to be involved in the Aeronautical Research Division. Betty laid the orders down and wondered what aeronautical research might be. She had no idea. As she pondered, her friend Anne Baumgartner burst into the room. "Guess what?" she said gloomily. "What?" Betty asked. "I've just been reassigned to Wright Field in Ohio," she said, waving a copy of her orders at Betty. Betty laughed and showed Anne her own orders. "So have I," she said. The two women burst into laughter. "Well, if we're going together, it won't be too bad. What do you think we'll be doing there?" "It all sounds very secretive, doesn't it?" Anne said. "It sure does. We'll just have to wait and find out, I guess," Betty said. 10 days later, Betty and Anne arrived at the Miami Hotel in Dayton, Ohio. They spent a restful night there, and in the morning were met by Major Frederick Borsotti, a tall, dark-haired man who escorted them by car to Wright Field. As they rode, Major Borsotti chatted to them about some of the work he was doing at the airbase. His area of expertise encompassed learning about compression shock waves on the wings of airplanes. Major Borsotti was the first man to see these and the first to photograph them. He told Betty that to do this, he had put a P-51D aircraft into a dive from 40,000 feet. Betty was impressed. The highest she had ever flown herself was 19,000 feet, and anything over 25,000 feet was considered dangerous, for 3 reasons. First, the lack of oxygen at such high altitudes caused hypoxia, which made pilots feel peaceful and sluggish. As a result, their judgment was impaired, and if they didn't get to a lower altitude and more oxygen fast, they could drift into unconsciousness and death. Second was the problem of extreme cold at such heights. The temperature could go down to minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or even lower. At such temperatures, a person would be instantly frostbitten. Third was the threat of an embolism. What happened to pilots at such an altitude was similar to what happened to deep-sea divers who resurfaced too quickly. They got the bends. Basically, the fast reduction in atmospheric pressure caused gas bubbles to form in the blood. These bubbles were mostly nitrogen and made a person feel itchy, suffer blurred vision, and then become paralyzed and die. Major Borsodi explained that a big problem for the United States in the war was that German airplanes could fly higher than Allied planes and were bombing them from higher altitudes. At Wright Field, the Americans were experimenting with high-altitude flying because the side that developed airplanes that could fly higher than all others would have a definite advantage in the air. By the time the Pontiac carrying Major Borsodi, Betty, and Anne pulled into Wright Field, Betty was beginning to wonder what she had left herself in for. Was she going to be flying at such heights? Or did the Air Force have something else in mind for her? Betty did not have to wait long to find out. A note was on the message board when she arrived, asking her and Anne to report immediately to Colonel Randolph Lovelace II, M.D., director of the Aero Medical Laboratory. Betty straightened her bun and set out with Anne Baumgartner to find Colonel Lovelace. The colonel turned out to be a kindly man of medium height and build, with his left hand heavily bandaged. "Ah, ladies, I have been waiting to meet you," he said in a pleasant voice, inviting them into his large office. "Please sit down, and I'll try to fill you in on why you are here." Betty and Anne sat in a comfortable, overstuffed easy chairs and peered across the desk at the colonel. Colonel Lovelace cleared his throat. "Welcome to Wright Field. I'm glad to have 2 WASPs on my staff. I think you can make a valuable contribution to the work we're doing here." Betty smiled. "Just what work is that?" she asked politely. Colonel Lovelace grinned. "Very cutting-edge work," he replied. "Let me tell you about it." Over the next hour, the colonel laid out the work he had been involved in and the strides he had made since the beginning of the war. In 1940, a stratochamber had been invented to simulate conditions at 40,000 feet. This meant that for the first time, the responses of the human body to high altitudes could be studied without the risk of actually being in the stratosphere. By 1943, much work had been done on radio communications, making it possible for aircraft to transmit radio messages from 40,000 feet. Now the research team had turned its attention to making and testing oxygen masks and flight suits that would allow pilots to fly at 35,000 feet and higher for long periods. Betty Greene and Anne Baumgartner were to be a part of the team that would be the first to test the new equipment. "Though, of course," Colonel Lovelace added, "I never ask my men or women to do anything I have not done myself." Betty did not fully understand how serious the colonel was about this until later that night in the mess hall. Over a bowl of beef stew and biscuits, she learned from one of the men on base that Colonel Lovelace had been the second person to ever jump from an airplane flying in the stratosphere. The colonel had jumped from 7½ miles up in an attempt to determine whether a parachutist could survive a drop from that height. He had jumped using a tethered line to activate his parachute in case he became unconscious. It was a good thing he had, because the jolt of the parachute opening had hit him with a force of 6 Gs, knocking him unconscious. As he fell silently through the near oxygenless atmosphere, his left glove slipped off, exposing his hand to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. An oxygen bottle strapped to the inside of his right leg supplied him with air to breathe as he fell. He had plummeted 3,400 feet before he regained consciousness and pulled his exposed hand into his sleeve. Colonel Lovelace had landed safely in a wheat field. He was rushed off to the hospital to treat his frostbitten hand. "So that explains the bandages," Betty said to Anne as they walked back to their new barracks for the night. The next morning, their work began. Betty and Anne were fitted with oxygen masks and began preparations for an eventual flight into the stratosphere aboard a modified 4-engine Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. They spent hours each day in the stratochamber discovering the tolerances and limits of their bodies under various stresses. By the end of the week, they had their first experience of high-altitude flying. Betty loved everything about it, especially the deep blue color of the sky and the almost endless vista of land below them. They had been maintaining an altitude of 35,000 feet for about an hour and a half when one of the officers scribbled a note and handed it to Betty, who grabbed it with her heavy, fur-lined glove. "Prepare for immediate descent. Pass it on," the note read. Betty passed the note to Anne. As Betty pulled her safety belt to its tightest setting, she wondered what the problem could be. Seconds later, the B-17 went into a steep dive. In less than 5 minutes, it had dropped 20,000 feet to a safer altitude of 15,000 feet. It was not until the plane had safely landed that Betty found out the full story. One of the airmen had accidentally disconnected his oxygen line, and by the time the problem was discovered, he was unconscious. No one knew whether there was time to save him, but the plane had dived as steeply as it could. By the grace of God, the airman had regained consciousness and made a full recovery. Although the incident had ended well, it made Betty vow to be extra careful. One wrong move at such altitudes could easily cost her her life. Several days later, Betty, along with Anne Baumgartner and some airmen, was conducting tests using electrified flying suits to see how warm people could stay. There was only one way to find out. When the B-17 reached 40,000 feet, the windows were wound down and the doors rolled back. Frigid air rushed into the plane, biting at Betty's face mask. Betty pulled her legs up under her chin and sat still, watching the younger gunner opposite her, who was conducting tests to see how weapons operated in such sub-zero temperatures. The gunner struggled to load the gun, the heavy gloves and extreme cold making it nearly impossible to move the ammunition into position. In the end, he just shrugged at Betty and laid the weapon aside. It was impossible to use it under such conditions. Next, Betty's attention was drawn to the lieutenant monitoring them all. He moved silently from one person to the next, checking their oxygen levels and intake valves. For some reason, Betty glanced down at her own oxygen gauge. To her horror, the needle was on 0. No oxygen was getting through to her. For a split second, Betty wanted to panic. Without oxygen, she would be unconscious within 30 seconds. But, thinking quickly, she waved her arms to get the lieutenant's attention. She pointed to her oxygen tank as he hurried over. She held her breath while the lieutenant felt his way down her intake tube. About a third of the way along, he looked up and then began massaging the tube. Betty knew immediately what had happened. The flexible hose had become blocked with ice that had formed from the condensation of her warm breath. She reached down to help, and the ice blockage was soon cleared. Life-sustaining oxygen flowed into her oxygen mask, and Betty gave the lieutenant a thumbs up. Not everyone survived the tests. A few days later, a colonel made a parachute jump from 40,000 feet. He did not use a tethered line to automatically open his chute, since he was experimenting with opening his own parachute. He blacked out soon after jumping from the airplane and plummeted to the ground, his unopened parachute strapped uselessly to his back. Days later, a pilot was diving his P-38 airplane from high altitude and was unable to regain control and pull out of the dive. The plane slammed into the ground, killing the pilot. Of course, everyone knew there were dangers involved in performing the tests, but Betty, like the others serving at Wright Field, was willing to accept the risk. It was mid-1944, and the war had reached an important phase. The Allies were preparing for a massive invasion of France to defeat the occupying German forces there, and needed every tactical advantage they could muster. So despite the ever-present danger, Betty happily threw herself into the work. As she did so, life at Wright Field seemed to fall into a routine for her.